It wasn't the way she looked at me that changed everything, it was the moment she leaned close, her voice soft against my ear. "You think I don't notice?" And suddenly, every glance, every touch, every second alone with her, felt impossible to ignore. It started the way it always did, like nothing had changed. His house had that same familiar warmth, the kind that made it easy to forget time. I'd been there so often it barely felt like visiting anymore. Shoes off by the door without thinking. A quiet, "I'm here," called out toward the living room. The low hum of a TV somewhere in the background. And then there was her. She moved through the house with an ease that was hard to explain, unhurried, composed, like everything around her naturally settled into place. That afternoon, she was in the kitchen, sunlight slipping in through the window and catching softly against her hair. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing that should have stood out, but I noticed it anyway. Maybe I had always noticed. "Hey," she said, glancing over her shoulder when she heard me. Her voice carried that same gentle warmth it always did, but now it felt different, like I was hearing it more clearly than before. I stepped into the kitchen, leaning lightly against the counter, trying to keep everything normal. We exchanged a few casual words, nothing important, just the kind of small talk that fills quiet spaces. But even that felt slower, like every second stretched just a little longer than it should. Then it happened. She reached for something on the shelf behind me, stepping closer without hesitation. I barely had time to react before her arm brushed lightly across my chest. It was such a small thing, an ordinary, accidental touch. But it didn't feel ordinary. Her sleeve grazed me softly, and for a brief second, everything else seemed to fade. The distant TV, the faint clatter of dishes, even my own thoughts, they all blurred into the background. All I could focus on was that fleeting contact, the warmth of it lingering long after she had already moved past me. And then there was the scent. Subtle, but unmistakable. Something soft and familiar, like it belonged in that space, like it had always been there and I was only just now noticing it. I straightened slightly, unsure what to do with myself, when I felt it, her presence still close, closer than before. When I looked up, she was already looking at me. Just for a second. But it was long enough. There was something in her expression, calm, steady, almost unreadable, and yet, not distant. If anything, it felt aware. Like she had noticed the same moment I had. Like she understood it in a way I didn't yet. Then, just as easily, she smiled. Soft. Natural. As if nothing had happened. And maybe nothing had. She turned back to what she was doing, the moment slipping away as quietly as it came. But it didn't leave me. I stayed there a second longer than I should have, my thoughts tangled in something I couldn't quite explain. It didn't make sense, none of it did. It was just a brief touch. A simple glance. So why did it feel like something had shifted? I told myself I was overthinking it. That it was nothing. That it meant nothing. But as I stood there, watching her move through the kitchen like she always had, it didn't feel like nothing anymore. And for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, she knew that too. The days that followed didn't feel different on the surface. I still showed up the same way, still walked through that front door like I had 100 times before. But inside, something had changed. It was subtle at first. Easy to ignore if I tried hard enough. But the more I paid attention, the harder it became to pretend everything was the same. She noticed me more. Not in a way anyone else would question, just small things. The way she'd ask how my day was and actually wait for the answer, her eyes steady on mine a second longer than usual. The way she'd say my name, softer somehow, like it carried a little more weight than before. And I noticed everything. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The quiet rhythm of her movements around the house. The calm confidence in the way she carried herself, and the faint hint of something else beneath it. Something I couldn't quite define. One evening, it was just the two of us in the living room. My friend had stepped out for a while, leaving behind a kind of quiet that felt heavier than it should have. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. The light from the screen flickered softly across the room, casting shadows that made everything feel slower, more intimate. I sat at one end of the couch. She sat beside me, not too close, not too far. Just close enough. At first, nothing happened. We exchanged a few casual comments about whatever was playing, the kind of conversation that doesn't really matter. But even that felt different now. There were pauses, longer ones. Moments where neither of us spoke, but neither of us moved away either. Then I became aware of it. Our hands. They rested on the cushion between us, only inches apart. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the space between them. Like it wasn't empty at all, but filled with something unspoken. I told myself not to think about it. But I couldn't stop noticing how still her hand was. How it hadn't moved away. And then, her fingers shifted. Just slightly. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then her hand moved again, slowly, almost cautiously, until her fingers brushed against mine. It was the lightest contact. Barely there. But it felt like everything. Warmth spread instantly, quiet but undeniable. Her skin was soft, steady, and she didn't pull away, not right away. Neither did I. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The room stayed silent except for the distant sound of the TV, but even that felt far away now. I didn't look at her at first. I wasn't sure I could. But when I finally did, she was already looking at me. Not surprised. Not uncertain. Just aware. There was a question in her eyes, but not one she expected me to answer out loud. It was softer than that. Something felt, not spoken. Her fingers shifted again, this time resting more fully against mine. Not gripping. Not holding tightly. Just there. Intentional. The air between us changed. It wasn't accidental anymore. It wasn't something I could brush off or explain away. And yet, neither of us said a word. After a few seconds, she gently withdrew her hand, as if nothing had happened. As if it had just been another passing moment. But it wasn't. Because this time, when the silence settled back in, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of something neither of us was ready to name. And for the first time, I realized, this wasn't just in my head anymore. It happened on a night that felt quieter than usual. The house had settled into that soft stillness that comes late, when everything slows down and even the walls seem to hold their breath. My friend had gone to bed early, leaving the rest of the house dim and half-lit. I should have left too. But I didn't. I stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, my thoughts circling the same moments over and over again, the couch, her hand, the way she hadn't pulled away right away. None of it made sense, and yet it refused to leave me alone. I didn't hear her walk in. Not at first. It was the faint shift in the air that made me turn slightly, the quiet awareness of someone standing closer than expected. And when I did, she was there, just a step away, watching me with that same calm, unreadable expression. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. I shook my head, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Sleep hadn't even been part of the question in my mind. Something like that. My voice sounded different to my own ears, quieter, more careful. She stepped closer then. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would seem unusual to anyone else. But close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence again, close enough that the space between us felt intentional. Too intentional. I didn't move. Neither did she. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching between us, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with everything we hadn't said. I became aware of every small detail. The faint scent of her perfume. The soft sound of her breathing. The way her eyes stayed on mine without wavering. And then, she leaned in. Just slightly. Enough that I could feel her presence shift closer to my side, enough that her voice, when she spoke, didn't need to rise above a whisper. "You think I don't notice?" The words were soft. Almost gentle. But they hit harder than anything she could have said out loud. Her breath brushed lightly near my ear as she spoke, warm and steady, sending a quiet tension through me that I couldn't explain. My body stilled instantly, like every instinct had paused at once. I didn't know how to respond. Didn't know what she meant, except that I did. Because in that moment, everything became clear. The looks, the pauses, the touch on the couch, none of it had been one-sided. None of it had been imagined. She had seen it. All of it. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to look at her. She was already watching me. Her expression hadn't changed much, still calm, still composed, but there was something deeper there now. Not accusation. Not discomfort. Awareness. And something else beneath it, something quieter, harder to name. Notice what? I managed, though the words felt weak even as I said them. For a second, it looked like she might answer. But she didn't. Instead, her gaze lingered on mine just a moment longer, as if measuring something, my reaction, maybe, or the silence between us. Then, just as gently as she had leaned in, she stepped back. The distance returned, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Not after that. A small, almost knowing smile touched her lips, not teasing, not mocking. Just, certain. And without another word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me exactly where I stood. Alone. But not really. Because the silence she left behind wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of what she had said, and everything she hadn't. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My thoughts were louder now, faster, impossible to control. She knew. Not just suspected. Not just guessed. She knew. And the way she said it, the way she looked at me afterward, it wasn't rejection. That was the part one couldn't ignore. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. Because something had shifted in that moment, something undeniable. Before, there had been doubt. Uncertainty. 100 ways to explain everything away. Now, there was none. Now, there was only the truth sitting quietly in the space between us. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pretend I didn't feel it anymore. After that night, nothing felt simple anymore. I told myself the easiest thing to do was create distance. So I did. I stopped coming over as often, made excuses that sounded reasonable enough. When I did show up, I stayed just long enough to keep things from feeling obvious, then left before the quiet moments had a chance to settle in. It should have helped. It didn't. Because even in absence, she stayed in my thoughts. That whisper replayed in my mind more times than I wanted to admit. The calm certainty in her voice. The way she hadn't needed an answer. She already had one. A few days later, I found myself back at the house again, standing at the door like I used to, but this time, there was hesitation in my hand before I knocked. The door opened, and there she was. For a second, neither of us spoke. Her expression didn't change much, still composed, still steady, but her eyes lingered on me, searching quietly, like she was noticing something I hadn't said yet. "You've been busy," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, a little," I replied, stepping inside, trying to keep my tone casual. But the air felt different now. Thicker. Like every movement carried more meaning than it should. I kept my distance that evening. Stayed in the living room, kept conversations short, avoided looking at her for too long. I thought if I could just get through it without another moment like before, things might settle back into place. But they didn't. Because every time I thought I was doing well, every time I convinced myself I was acting normal, I'd feel her presence somewhere nearby. Passing through the room. Pausing just slightly when she walked by. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But enough for me. Later, when I decided to leave, I moved quickly. Grabbed my things, headed toward the door before I could second-guess it. "Leaving already?" Her voice stopped me. I turned, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, got some stuff to take care of." I reached for the door handle. But before I could open it, her hand closed gently around my arm. It wasn't tight. She wasn't trying to stop me. But it was enough. The warmth of her touch spread instantly, grounding me in place. Her fingers rested just above my wrist, steady, certain, like she knew I wouldn't pull away. And I didn't. "Hey," she said softly. There was something different in her voice this time. Less composed. Still calm, but beneath it, something more fragile. I turned to face her fully. She didn't let go right away. "Why have you been avoiding me?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusing. It was honest. And that made it harder to answer. "I'm not," I started, but the words fell apart before they could form into anything believable. Her eyes stayed on mine, not pushing, not forcing, just waiting. Still holding my arm. I swallowed, trying to find something that made sense. Something safe. But nothing felt right. Because the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't just about me. It was about her. About everything that had shifted between us without permission. "I just didn't think it was a good idea," I said finally, my voice quieter now. Her expression softened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Why?" she asked. The word was barely above a whisper. And I realized then, this wasn't just about curiosity for her. This mattered. The room felt smaller somehow, the space between us filled with everything we weren't saying. Her hand was still on my arm, her thumb shifting just slightly, almost absent-mindedly. The movement was subtle, but it sent a quiet tension through me that made it even harder to think clearly. "Because," I hesitated, exhaling slowly. "Because I don't know what this is." The honesty surprised even me. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her gaze dropped briefly to where her hand rested against me, as if she had just become aware of it again. But she didn't pull away. Not immediately. When she looked back up, there was something different in her eyes now. Not uncertainty. Understanding. Neither do I, she admitted softly. The words settled between us, quiet but heavy. And in that moment, the distance I had tried so hard to create didn't feel as strong anymore. That night didn't end at the door. It couldn't. After she said, "Neither do I," the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was honest. For the first time, it felt like we were both standing in the same place, without pretending otherwise. She let her hand fall away from my arm slowly, not abruptly, as if she was giving me the choice to leave. I didn't take it. Instead, I stepped back inside. The door closed quietly behind me, and the sound felt heavier than it should have, like something had just been decided without either of us saying it out loud. We moved into the kitchen without speaking. The lights were dim, softer than before, casting a quiet calm over everything. It felt like a different space now, or maybe we were just different inside it. She leaned lightly against the counter, arms resting at her sides, while I stood a few steps away, unsure where to place myself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled softly, her gaze lowering before lifting back to meet mine. "I didn't say anything before because I thought it would pass," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but quieter than usual, less guarded. I frowned slightly. "What would?" "The way you look at me." There was no judgment in her tone. Just honesty. My chest tightened, but I didn't interrupt. She continued, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter, a small, absent movement. "I told myself it was nothing. That you'd move on, or realize it wasn't real." Her eyes flickered for just a second, something uncertain passing through them before she steadied again. "But you didn't," she added softly. The words settled between us. I swallowed, my voice low when I finally spoke. "I tried." That earned the faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close. Something that understood more than it showed. "I know," she said. The way she said it, it wasn't dismissive. It was gentle. Like she had been watching, noticing every small change, even when I thought I was hiding it well. Another quiet pause filled the room, but this one felt different, less tense, more open. Then she stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough to close the space that had felt so uncertain before. "I noticed everything," she said, her voice softer now. "The way you'd go quiet when I walked into a room. The way you stopped meeting my eyes, like that would make it disappear." I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it didn't quite reach that point. "Didn't work." "No," she said gently. There was a moment where neither of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached for my hand. This time, it wasn't accidental. Her fingers slipped over mine, warm and steady, settling into place like they had already decided where they belonged. Her touch wasn't tight or demanding. It was calm. Certain. I felt it instantly, the same quiet warmth, but deeper now. Real. I looked down at our hands for a second, then back up at her. She didn't look away. "I didn't push you away because I didn't understand it," she said quietly. "I didn't, because part of me didn't want to." The honesty in her voice made something shift inside me, something heavier, but clearer too. I stepped a little closer without thinking. Our shoulders brushed lightly, the contact sending a soft tension through the space between us. She didn't move back. If anything, she leaned into it just slightly. Carefully, like she was testing the moment, her thumb traced a small, absent circle against my hand. It was such a simple gesture. But it felt like everything. "This isn't simple," I said, my voice low. "I know," she replied. Her head tilted just slightly, her gaze softening, not uncertain, not afraid. Just open. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something we had to avoid. It felt like something we were finally willing to face. Together. After that night, something quiet settled between us. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Something steadier. The next time I came over, it didn't feel like I was stepping into the unknown anymore. There was still tension, still that awareness every time we were close, but it wasn't something we were running from now. It was something we understood. The house was calm, late afternoon lights stretching across the floor in long, golden lines. My friend was out again, the familiar pattern repeating, but this time, it didn't feel accidental. She was in the living room when I walked in, sitting comfortably with a book resting in her lap. She looked up when she heard me, and for a second, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. Not the polite kind. Not the distant one I had gotten used to before. This one stayed. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, closing the door behind me. There was no awkwardness, no forced conversation. Just a quiet understanding that made everything feel slower, calmer. I sat down beside her, closer than I would have before. Not enough to draw attention, but enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence beside me again. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing important. The kind of conversation that fills space easily. But underneath it, there was something else, something unspoken, steady, waiting. At some point, the conversation faded. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Her book rested forgotten beside her now, and I found myself watching the way the light caught softly against her face, the way she seemed completely at ease in that moment. "You're not avoiding me anymore," she said quietly. I glanced at her, a faint smile forming. "No." She studied me for a second, like she was making sure I meant it. "Good," she replied. The word was simple, but it carried something warmer beneath it. There was a pause. Then, slowly, she shifted closer. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would break the calm. Just enough. Her shoulder brushed lightly against mine, the contact soft but intentional. I felt it instantly, that familiar warmth settling in again, but this time, there was no tension pulling it apart. I turned slightly toward her. She was already looking at me. There was no question in her eyes now. No hesitation. Just quiet certainty. Without thinking too much about it, I spoke, my voice low, honest. "I meant what I said, before." Her expression softened, just slightly. "I know." The air between us felt still, but not fragile. It felt grounded. Then she lifted her hand. At first, it looked like she was going to fix something, maybe adjust my collar, brush off something from my shoulder. But when her fingers reached me, they didn't move away right away. They lingered. Her touch was light, careful, but deliberate. The tips of her fingers rested against my shoulder for a second longer than necessary, then slowly traced upward, smoothing the edge of my collar. The gesture was simple. But the way she stayed there, wasn't. I didn't move. I didn't want to. Her hand lowered slightly, resting for a moment near my chest, and I could feel the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat against her palm. It made everything feel more real, more immediate. Then, gently, she stepped closer. Close enough that the space between us disappeared. There was no rush in her movements, no sudden change. Just a quiet decision unfolding in real time. She tilted her head just slightly, her gaze softening as she held mine. And then, she leaned in, resting her forehead lightly against mine. The contact was barely there. But it felt like everything had come to a single point. I exhaled slowly, my eyes closing for just a second as the moment settled in. I could feel her breath, calm and steady, matching mine without effort. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Because this wasn't uncertainty anymore. Her hand shifted gently, coming to rest against mine once again, her fingers slipping into place with quiet familiarity. And this time, there was no hesitation. No doubt. Just the quiet understanding that whatever this was, we had already crossed into it. And neither of us was turning back. By the time the following evening arrived, there was a calmness between us that hadn't existed before. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden declarations or hurried gestures, just a quiet sense that we had moved past all the unspoken tension and into something more grounded. The house felt warmer somehow. The light from the late afternoon sun spilled softly through the windows, stretching across the floor in golden beams, dust motes floating lazily through the air. I found myself lingering in the living room longer than I had planned, waiting for her to notice, and she did. She looked up from the book she had picked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, everything else melted away. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. The way she simply looked at me, calm and assured, said more than words ever could. I smiled faintly, and she returned it, a small curve of her lips that felt full of meaning. Without a word, she moved closer on the couch, just enough that our shoulders touched lightly. The warmth of her presence settled around me, steadying my pulse in a way that nothing else could. I felt her hand brush against mine, not in a sudden gesture, but in a careful, intentional way. Her fingers rested lightly over mine, letting me feel the steady rhythm of her touch. It was safe. It was gentle. And yet it was charged with all the quiet intimacy we had built over countless small moments, the fleeting touches, the lingering glances, the evenings spent together without the need for conversation. I turned my head slightly, glancing at her, and she leaned in just a fraction, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not desperate or urgent. It was soft, natural, and entirely unforced, a statement of presence rather than possession. I felt the warmth of her hair against my chest, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the calm stillness of the room, and a slow certainty settled in my chest. We didn't speak. There was no rush to define the feeling, no pressure to name it aloud. It existed already, solid and undeniable, in the space between us. I could feel her quiet heartbeat, a steady rhythm that matched the subtle rise and fall of my own chest, and it anchored me in a way that nothing else had. Minutes passed in silence, each one stretching long enough to be savored, long enough to feel every small movement, every subtle shift in the air. She adjusted slightly, just enough to let our hands entwine fully, her fingers curling naturally around mine. The contact was firm but gentle, a simple acknowledgement of what had grown between us, nurtured patiently over time. I finally leaned my head against hers, and she tilted toward me in return. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just a quiet harmony. I realized, in that moment, that the story we had been creating together was complete in its own way. It wasn't dramatic or conventional. It wasn't about grand gestures or public declarations. It was about the slow accumulation of trust, warmth, and understanding, culminating in a simple, steady connection that neither of us wanted to break. I exhaled slowly, letting the calm settle fully over me. Her cheek rested against my shoulder, her fingers intertwined with mine, and for the first time, it felt entirely right. Whatever uncertainty had existed before had dissolved. We had crossed the subtle line from tension to connection, from longing to companionship, from quiet fascination to a mature, shared understanding. And in that quiet, golden light, I realized something that words could never capture. This was more than desire. It was calm, steadfast, and real. It was ours. For the first time in a long time, I felt entirely at peace, and completely certain that this was exactly where we were meant to be.